Okay, great. Go ahead.
Sure. My advisor, Harold Leitenberg, was established in the field, kind of a hidden gem in the behavioral to cognitive behavioral view. So there's the cognitive tradition in the cognitive psychotherapy, and there's a behavioral cognitive tradition. And he was really a leader in that. I got hooked up with him. And then I was like, hey, I'm starting to work on this theory, in the beginning. And then it was in the summer of 1997 that I had my flash of insight on the tree of knowledge. So I'm stoned one night and I draw out the 4 cones and my life changes. And then I start working on this, and he's like, it's interesting, but he's an empiricist. I mean, virtually all psychologists are empiricists, especially behavioral cognitive.
Right. People would criticize me as being a positivist and box me in really quickly that way. Totally. And yeah, it's very like kind of mainstream view of what.
So then I was like, but I'm really good and best. And he was like, you'll never get a job doing theory. Nobody does fucking theory. So I had to do a totally different dissertation, which was actually right at one level. It was right and wrong, it turned out. So I did my dissertation. I did an experimental analysis of Beck's concept of cognitive errors.
Oh, cool.
That was my dissertation. And then I went and because I did that, I got my postdoc with Aaron Beck at the University of Pennsylvania.
Oh, wow.
So I did, and I was there then for 4 years. So Harold was correct, and that I would not have been able to advance. At the same time, he was wrong, because in 2003, when I went on to the job market after I was leaving, I was a research assistant professor for Beck in his lab. And then I was like, I can't fucking do this. I want to be a tenure track professor. But it's like, where do I go? Everywhere I applied, I was going to then, I was talking about the grants I was doing and everything else, because that's this little place at James Madison has this weird combined integrated clinical and school professional program that is looking to blend across, it's combined across the practice areas. So in the practice side of the house, you have clinical, counseling, and school as the 3 main arms. So this program unifies those practice areas, and then it's integrated across across the biopsychosocial levels and across the major schools of thought. So it's a combined integrated structure that then affords an identity of a generalist psychological doctor, okay, that can connect across these domains, as opposed to seeing these as different, and fundamentally incompatible or competitive structures, training structure. But in the ad, it says to actually do this with coherence is enormously difficult, precisely because there is no meta theory that affords the capacity to see the coherent interrelations between these domains.
No, I've never thought of like these departments as holding meta theory, because the University of Maryland has a social, organizational, cognitive, and it does that. And it's really like, I thought about like, oh, that's gonna be hard to get a job. If I go there, it could be really fun intellectually, but then like jumping out of that ecology then becomes hard as an organizational person or as a
totally.
Yeah,
because the system is used to. And then I went and applied. And then everywhere else I applied, I was doing it because I was running this study, this randomized controlled clinical trial, fucking fascinating, crazy fucking study. I recently made a suicide attempt, and then how to get grants for that, and how to publish on that and all that, and that whole, the empirical enterprise. And then for James Madison, I came and gave my job talk on my theory. It's a theoretical unification of psychology as my job talk, and got the job. And then I came down. And I've been here ever since 2003. I've been at James Madison in this really unique program. And then I became director of it for 12 years. So I then had the challenge to create it in an ecology. It's like, can you actually build a training system for psychological doctors that is actually combined, integrated, unified? And that's what I've been doing to demonstrate that is actually totally feasible and totally coherent and totally doable across all the various different levels. But I got into the story simply because one of my joyous historical moments in 2003 was calling Harold Leitenberg, who I love, but we always challenged, once I was kind of a positivist, and then I became, as I saw the fundamental problems of that you just can't keep applying fucking methods if you don't know what you're actually doing. And then so he and I, by that time, I was already mature in this area. And so he and I were always arm wrestling. But anyway, so we had the loving relation, and then I got to call him. It's like, Harold, I just got fucking hired because of my fucking theory.
You're vindicated finally.
I mean, he's like, oh, I'm so happy for you, Greg. It's like, and he was right. I don't think I would have gotten there if I hadn't done the dissertation, but he was also wrong in saying you'd never get hired by your theory. And I just got so fucking lucky because there are basically no programs like this. But the idea that they had the opening for it, It's actually where I went as an undergrad too. So it's perfect. It was perfect for my home and all of that. So it was a wonderful set of fortuitous alignments. And I was, feel very, very grateful to be at a place where I can do what I love.
Yeah, no, that and I've talked to John about this, about you, and like, you're living the dream. Like, you're an outlier, and your advisor was probably right in saying, like, statistically, this is a bad plan, Greg. Like, don't do this bad plan because I care about you. And like, luckily, you kind of both did and didn't do that, and then we're able to kind of find your voice and a home at the same time.
Totally, it's a wonderful description. I feel heard if we're doing circling. But no, it's exactly what happened. And I always felt very, very grateful. And the thin line to slide through that across many different variables, not normative by any stretch. And I feel very, very fortunate to have that.
Yeah, and just to follow up a little bit, like, how many students have you seen graduate the program, and are they also like applying the ideas well, or did they have to kind of buckle back, or what happened?
It's really fascinating. So certainly, I mean, I've had doc students. I think I've graduated 25 doc students since I got here in 2003, started hooding them in 2007, would have one or two every year from 2007 to now. And I think maybe I'm at 20. So I have a little legacy of 20 doctoral students. That's pretty good. And then the problem with the fucking theory, Robert, is that it's just a gigantic, cathedral. Okay. And although when people get into it, they see all these pieces that actually make sense, but it's actually a fucking language, basically. It's like you have to like upgrade a language. Okay. It's like I built this meta-psychological language. Okay? And what I see happening to people is that with one or two exceptions, the vast majority of very bright doctoral students can grab a part of the theory, okay? And then as they try to grab more of it, they lack the background knowledge and the nuance, okay? And then their big picture capacity relative to the applied capacity, I'm just gifted in that way. I can go super fucking meta and then right into the clinic room and have coherence, okay? That's a talent. Most people, the further they get back abstraction, then it gets all wobbly up here because they don't have it like crystal clear. And because it's crystal clear, it's fuzzy. And then its utility, as it gets fuzzy back here, its utility in the clinic room gets fuzzy, okay? So over and over, what I would see would happen is somebody would grab a piece of it, see an area they're interested in, and then apply it and bring it and utilize it in that area. And they're like, oh, this is really great. But I have a student over here doing that with intimate partner violence, okay? I have somebody else doing it here in child development. I have somebody else here doing it here with borderline personality disorder. I have somebody else doing it here with psychological mindfulness. I have somebody else doing it here with depression, okay? And they're learning how to speak the system in the context of their particular domain of expertise. There is no way that they then can actually get together and speak it across themselves, okay? So what is not happening with the system, and is that I can't, it's too fucking big and complicated, and I haven't figured out a way for a zone of proximal development for a set of individuals to actually come learn it and then get me out and then have a community of people that can speak it without me there, okay? So that it could then grow, because that's what you need to actually have a generative mechanism, use a Schmuckdenberger term. You want a generative mechanism in relation. You actually have to have a culture of people that actually speak the language. And now all it is I'm at the epicenter. I can race everywhere. I can go to John, I can go to Jordan Hall, I'll Rosetta Stone everybody's fucking system. But unfortunately, this system is so blared that people kind of look at it. Even John, who I've done a lot of fucking work with, is unbelievably fucking bright. He's still at a place where like he gets pieces of it. He's not speaking you talk, yeah.
I've seen him and you talk on one of your channel videos, and you asked him, like, or even you and Jordan Hall, I think too, and you'd go, hey, what do you think about this idea? And I could just sense that like you got it, and maybe you weren't articulating it quite the way it was landing with them, or they weren't quite seeing it the way you were seeing it. And I had to go, oh, but you always get a sense, like from my perspective on you, is like you're getting something. And then the more, like John gives me a way into your system, I think is a really easy way for me to say it from my point of view, is like, okay, well, now that I was looking at your map mind one to mind two to mind three, like the two mirrored heads, and going, okay, now I'm starting to make connections using my language from like my background and then my knowledge of John to then frame. And then I can start to see the big picture. And then some of the things that you're bringing in that really just aren't really in most people's systems, especially not as formalized as yours. So, and yeah, so I can imagine what people are.
So this is what's so exciting about John. Okay, so I think that his, you should be worried about me. This is one of the issues I have to, I'm actually sitting on, I believe I'm sitting on like some of the greatest discoveries that in 100 years people will fucking come back to and be like, why the fuck did it take people so long to see that these were the discoveries? Because it's always been ahead of the time. So then my phenomenological first person experience of being across the history is like, I'm looking at shit. You guys just can't fucking see it. History will be right. Okay. But then that makes you a particular way. So I'm also a clinician. I'm very sensitive to ego dynamics. And so I always like to frame that as a process so we can at least point to it if I'm in the midst of a dialogue. Okay.
Well, that's the strength of yours because you're like humble about sharing your ideas because you can appreciate the confusion and the background that people will be bringing, all the baggage and things like that.
It took me a long time to actually really work it through, but I do have clinical skills that afforded me the capacity for consistent reciprocal opening and the development of a flexible adaptive structure, as opposed to reciprocal narrowing and bitterness around narcissism.
Right. You're not just like bitter about your system, and you're really like open to letting people bring themselves to it. And you're not trying to just debate. No, you're wrong. Look at this. Because like I come from economics and I really wanted to study like libertarian economics, which there's just no jobs. Again, like I'm interested in a lot of things that there's no jobs for. Sure. So I'd see like a comment on TV and a friend would go, oh, that's a pretty good idea. And I would just say like, well, if you have 2.5 hours, I can break it down why it's just the worst idea. And even though this like really successful human being said it, it's like logically a false idea. But like, who wants to do that? Like your best friend who cares about you and the truth might really sit with you, but then a stranger at the bus is never gonna, oh, what do you mean theory of knowledge? Like,
totally. I mean, believe me, I've lived that, my relationship to, and in the intersection of physics, psychology, and philosophy. I mean, that's what I do. And it's just sort of like, oh my God, I can see all of the proper relations between physics, philosophy, and psychology that the Enlightenment fucked and that we can get right. But, the people are embedded in whatever. What the last thought, I didn't quite finish the thought that got me on this that I wanted to share with you, is a historical thing. I don't think there's ever been anywhere near the kind of meta theoretical synthesis, especially in psychology and maybe ever, that has actually emerged between me and John. Okay.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right, especially because you're not trying to just posit a nuanced theory. You're really trying to like unite psychology. And I've read William James and gone to conferences in these giant rooms on ethics and history and theory of mind. And yeah, it's super interesting that you're taking like the biopsychosocial nuance that kind of has popped up here and there and just fleshing it all out and incorporating.
So what happened now, so I built this structure, which is actually really even a larger meta structure than John's. But anyway, it's a meta structure. And inside my meta structure, I have this loose thing called neurocognitive functionalism. Okay. Neurocognitive functionalism basically says, okay, there's an information processing stack inside the nervous system. And fundamentally what it is doing is it's calculating paths of behavioral investment.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the basic structure. Okay. So it's a neurocognitive functional model of animal investment in the agent arena relation. Okay. That's and that basic meta architecture provides the framework for understanding the reciprocal complexity building feedback loop that went from life, living organisms and all those kingdoms, into the Cambrian explosion, where we get sensory motor looping, emergence of the animals, which move as coordinated singularities in the agent arena relation in a way that plants and other living creatures just don't. And then I realized that the proper descriptive metaphysics of that pattern of behavior is capital M mind. Okay, that's the third dimension of complexity on the tree of knowledge. We could call this mental evolution, the set of which would be properly mind. And that's kind of a neologism as to why it's capital. In other words, a new word that although many people going all the way back to George Romanes called mental evolution, have seen the evolution of the animal kingdom, animal cognition, animal behavior as radically different. any kid will watch birds and bees on plants and be like, yeah, birds and bees are totally different than plants. Behave different. Okay, so I have this generalized behavioral investment model, okay, that places the concept of cognition, neurocognition, as a hierarchical regulating function, managing behavioral investment, and that's going to grow from some sort of recursive computational system into a phenomenologically available mind two. Okay, so that's mind one, it's the neurocognition, and then somehow the integrated information of that processing gets yoked together. That's actually the binding problem, or the hard problem of consciousness, is the mind one to mind two yoking system. And then that then becomes a central mind's eye that then is extended into a model of self. And then we can talk, we then create mind three justification on top of that structure. So I have all of that, but it's loose and it's weak. Meaning that's not
loose and weak. Yeah.
It's too generalized to make, I mean, it's perfect for, like, the unified theory is beautiful because what it does is does optimal gripping. It grabs a hold of an unbelievable number of common sense truths and causes them to sing together. Okay.
Yeah, I think of just like systems and then these qualitative shifts. And so like there's a qualitative level and then there's like a shift and then a new qualitative level that you can't really go under or back into. And then there's this other like social justifying qualitative level that isn't really explainable in terms of the lower levels exactly.
Completely. And I figured out all of that, both in terms of its vision logic in relationship to what that was the initial, this gestalt, there's a vision logic of the cones, okay? And then I applied propositional logos eventually to actually figure out the proper relation between, why isn't it just one big cone, which many people kind of think of it is.
Right.
And it's like, no, there's emergence within a dimension of matter, and there's emergence between these other dimensions of complexification or planes of existence. What are those? And what is the novelty? And what do I mean? And how does it work? And that's the unbelievable tree of knowledge insight, which actually solves an heretofore previously unsolvable with precision specification of the different kinds of emergence within matter, life, and mind, between matter, life, and mind. Okay. And nobody has that with the level of precision that the tree of knowledge brings. And so I'm out here at this macro level, new map of big history. So big history is the naturalistic picture that says, hey, we can at least have two axes: time back to Big Bang, okay, and complexity, or is what they usually call it. Although I realized from John, that complexification is the more proper word.
Right, because it's successful complexity. It's not just adding.
It's
complexity.
not just adding complexity. It's the systematic integration of parts to create holistic patterns, which actually is properly described as complexification. I used to call it complexity, but John educated me properly in relation. So now I always refer to it as complexification. Which is much more precise, because in fact, that was always an annoyance to me, because I knew that the term complexity was overgeneralized to the kinds of things that I was specifying.
Right. It's just random when you talk about complexity. It's all just random. But when you start to say integrated and beings,
integrated, differentiated for the whole. Okay. And that's what it is. What are the parts? How are they differentiated? How are they coordinated? Creates functional at the higher order whole. And that's
That's all three, right? Differentiated, coordinated, and like one being, right?
Yeah. Completely. So that was really helpful, because I'm always trying to find the right precise language. And that's why it is also, by the way, an arcane academic project. Okay. Like, who the fuck on the bus wants to know the history of the difference between complexity and the proper nuance of complexification and their fine-tuned differentiations as to why this diagram, now originally called complexity, is properly specified as complexification? I mean, what the fuck, right? It's like, dude, I just need to get to my job. It's like,
it is. It's an order of like priorities, right? You need to have your kids taken care of, and also have just the high need for cognition and the desire to know more and all these kind of things. And then once you have those, then you're like, ooh, who is Gregg? Who is John? Who is these? Who are these people?
Gotta have that shit in place.
Well, yeah, and like, there's so many great systems theorists that aren't like published, but are now online in these like lecture series. So for a system lover, this is like a golden age, maybe.
We are returning. I mean, Hegel's coming back, system series are coming back. And of course, we're now coming on the tip of what the postmodern critique of modernism is, which leaves us chaotic, fragmented pluralism. And everybody's like, what the fuck? All we have is information and no organization. We got to return back to organization. So it is. It's a golden time. The last thing I'll say, which I didn't quite, so here I am building this optimal grip at the macroscopic level. okay? And then finding the joint points. So the joint points are the technical term between the dimensions to say, okay, the tier of knowledge gives us a descriptive metaphysical picture, meaning I have concepts and categories, clarifies the vision logic that then affords me clarity about the scientific ontology, meaning, hey, there's science, it's got an epistemology, it then generates an ontology of nature. The tree of knowledge gives us a vision logic for the ontological claims of science relative to what I call the ontic reality of matter, life, mind, and culture. Okay, so you get matter, life, mind, and culture is the map of the ontic. That's the shit that's independent of our beliefs. And then you get the physical, biological, psychological, and social sciences, which are scientists' constructions and maps of the ontic, the ontological theories. Okay?
Right. So you're giving a place for representation and reality both to like sit in your system without hating each other.
Totally. Right.
Yeah.
And it finally is a map of the map and the territory. We have a map of both the map and the territory in proper relation. That's what the descriptive metaphysics of the tree of knowledge does. And it's super exciting because it's like the big history people, all they have is the two fucking axes. They have the time axis and the complexity axis, not complexification. And they don't really capture the proper metaphysical relationship between the evolution of science. Some sort of do, the evolution of science and what it actually is doing in terms of generating an ontology and the ontic reality, the independent of human belief representation. Tree of knowledge gives you the proper map of science and the territory it's mapping. And that's a whole new dimension, you know, and that's what people are fucking missing. They have, oh, map and territory. Actually, you need a map of the map and territory. That's a whole nother thing. Okay. And people are confused.
Because like, especially in the non-relational focused kind of era we're in science, like you're adding that back in. You're saying, no, the relationship matters, and here it is.
Totally. And now I actually place a position of the human knower, observing the relations of knowers in the known. And now it's a macroscopic, as opposed to trying to get rid of the knower through some physical realism, which always was insane. Always had to come back and say, well, how did you know about physical reductionism? John was unbelievably clear on this point, and the synergy between us has been good. So the fundamental point is I have this macroscopic mapping, and what it afforded really is solves the problem of psychology, and we can get clearer about what that is. But then I'm above there doing my thing, and then I decided I had to become a fucking shaman on a hill and create some goddamn cartoon of a garden. But the bottom line is then when I read John, okay, so John has the golden key to cognition. Okay, that's what, theoretically, he's got the golden key to cognition. Okay, so I have this little thing called neurocognitive functionalism, in which I have this pretty much container. This is the weak generalized container for the thing called cognition in the world. Okay, not artificial cognition, although you have to have proper relation to that. You have the neurocognitive functionalism, but it's not specified, okay, with much in the way of richness. Johns climbs up the mountain of metapsychology on the complete other side, and he's stacking it both with philosophical sophistication, east-west insight, and all the beauty that John brings as a fucking human being, and this fundamental cognitive science insight about how to grip the concept of cognition, both in relationship to epistemology and knowing in general, and to create a descriptive taxonomy of knowing, the 4 Ps, and in relationship to a proper meta theory of neuroinformation processing, okay, that functionally ties together both it's the evolutionary, the cognitive science, and phenomenology, okay, and then also affords us a particular kind of way for education and interrelation that gets us out of subject-object bullshit and places us in a pragmatic transjective, you know, which is absolutely what we need for the dynamic understanding of the evolution of the future, okay? So I then find this, and then I drop John's golden key of cognition in my little placeholder for neurocognitive functionalism. And man, that's like a key in a lock. Oh, so I have this placeholder, and John's richness drops into that placeholder, right, and then does it in a way that like now I can take like my influence matrix, okay, and what it's fucking mapping, and be like, oh, actually what the influence matrix maps is the intersubjective recurrent relevance realization process of 2 people in relation, okay? Like the entire map I built, which was the motivational and emotional map, now takes John's perceptual relevance realization, drops that fucker in there, puts it in a relational context, and then spins it with dynamic clarity. Okay, I mean, that's just because
you've got the emotional and the bioeconomic and then he's got the cognitive and the conscious at different levels and different fidelities, and they just kind of, because his system mentions like Watts's networks, and it mentions relevance realization and resource collection, like the battery metaphor of Simon.
So I go evolution, okay, back, and I go behavioral. So I actually then drop into Skinner. So I'm Skinner and E.O. Wilson and Consilience and the sociobiology, and then back into, you know, all the bioecological economic structures there. And then I also, part of my whole journey in solving the problem of psychology, I had to figure out Skinner. Because at first I hated Skinner. Okay?
Right, as one should. Then you learn to appreciate him as you realize,
like,
he was just doing this really narrow, beautiful
Once
thing.
you realize what he actually did, and then the depth of which he got out of it, when it was just sort of like, and then where his fundamental epistemological error was, or at least limitation or narrowness. And as I told John, I was like, and now John, I can hear this, listen to this occasionally. He's like, he'll be like, well, it's a variation in selection and retention process. That's because I planted that in his head. I was like, John, you're inner Skinner. Okay. Your recursive relevance realization is a variation, selection, retention, evolutionary process, which is exactly what Skinner said. He just put it in the context of the environment and the agent arena exchange that you could instrumentally observe from a third person.
Right. He's externalized everything, which isn't wrong, but it's just too narrow to be like the actually perfect. He was the head of the world for a while.
Totally. But he fucked it up in terms of said, okay, actually, he really can't get into cognition as epistemology. He just turns it into unbelievably instrumental pragmatism.
Right.
That makes him basically like, I don't even know what a theory is. All I know is what I can basically do. And I can show you that I can follow this empirical principle of observation in relationship to this structure. And I can get the flow of behavioral energy in this direction in the terms of the process by which I set up schedules of reinforcement. It's like, okay, great. That is crucial. In fact, look at the whole, you know, social dilemma, Tristan, all the fucking algorithm people. That's basically what they do. But fundamentally, understand the inner process from the inside. To say that that's irrelevant or say that it's outside of the scope of science, you're clapping with one fucking hand, buddy. There's no goddamn way you're going to actually create a synthetic structure of understanding if you can't understand understanding. I mean, you know, you're done. So anyway, I always knew he was done, but I didn't know how much brilliance there was in it. But I figured behavioral investment theory is essentially a weak neurocognitive functionalism coupled to Skinner, coupled to evolution. Okay? And then now with John, I come and find somebody who's got an unbelievably rich, detailed, specified cognition that sits in the neurocognitive functional picture. And then when you have that, you now have two fundamentally different meta theories that were completely independently developed. That has one that has a frame for it inside of a macroscopic frame that actually solves the problem of ontology and metaphysics. And then you drop this particular piece that's unbelievably central, and they sit together synergistically and create a fundamentally different picture. You want validity, and you want the capacity, like especially if you use some basic notions about issues around, we'll just say pragmatic intelligibility. Use some of John's terms. I mean, the pragmatic intelligibility here is just off the fucking charts. You don't have to worry about a replication crisis. Just look at the interrelations and then apply them with some degree of sophistication, and boom, you know, it's an unbelievable godsend. And I can't believe people are paying attention to it. It's like you realize that this never has happened before, as far as I'm concerned. You look at any of you get the theorists. You know, you get Freud, and then he's following by Jung, and then Jung splits him off. Okay, you get James, and then you get James's followers, and then other people split off. What you find me an instance where you have two independent meta theories that actually come together, form a dialogue, and form a higher order theory. I've never seen that.
That's a good challenge. I'm going to accept that gauntlet.
If you find that, I'd really be interested, because my basic point is
I love history. Yeah. So
as far as I'm concerned, I don't think you see two independent meta theoretical structures ever get woven together to create a higher order synthesis. And that's certainly what I'm seeing in relation to my work with John.
Yeah, and you both were kind of at these bottlenecks that you're meeting, and your openness to want to kind of like have a better theory rather than fame, let's say. Like you keep feeding off each other, and now it has momentum.
Totally.
Right. Like I don't know you that well, but I know John. John's not trying to like finish his theory and then retire, which is actually a really smart academic move. And I've seen a lot of people do that, and they go, great, I was unheard. And then I finally got heard, and now I'm going to rest on that, and it's going to be awesome, which it is. But then it doesn't go like into the 21st century or into the 22nd century or things like that.
No, I mean, since I'd really, especially once I started on the garden, my whole thing evolved to the back half of the 21st century. So my entire orientation basically is I'm going to align my baton of energy to the back half of the 21st century, because that's really where I feel particularly basically aligned in relationship to the evolution of sort of cultural consciousness, as it were.
Yeah, and so awesome. So let me go through some questions.
No,
and
sorry, yeah,
that
there
was,
it is.
no, that was excellent. This was all thrilling and excellent. And again, like I was saying at the very beginning, I just keep getting more appreciation for your work the more I can kind of understand it.
Essentially, what happened is that nobody had my diagnosis is this: there's a thing called the Enlightenment gap, which I'll talk about. That's the failure once we develop modern empirical natural science and its success with Newton in physics. Okay, and then what that implied for our philosophical understanding was such that it generated a subset of understanding by a set of problems like matter and motion, okay, with unbelievable precision, rigor, and clarity, okay? But then what happened is the way that was structured epistemologically and ontologically, with the frames of reference that people had, is there's a complete failure to fundamentally understand that set of knowledge in relationship to mind, and then we can put quotes in that, but this whole cluster, okay, of matter-mind relations. So this AKA mind-body problem. So you get this coming out of the Enlightenment, this ubiquity of, oh my God, what is this duality, non-duality thing? So I just call it a matter-mind relation, or colloquially a mind-body problem, okay? And then the emergence of science and its authority to make truth claims, okay, in the modernist sense that says, no, we're actually transcending cultures and making truth claims. The fucking sun is made of hydrogen atoms. I don't care what any indigenous population says. Okay, it's your modernist, elitist, but also good justified argument claim versus the postmodern claim that says, okay, and then what relevance are we catching to this? Who has power in relationship to this? What's the transcendent truth claims? What's the epistemology of humanity and social construction? It's perspectival knowing, etc. Okay, and then you clusterfuck the assertions of modernity relative to postmodernity, and you get the science, society, and subjective knowledge relation. Like, what is science and what kinds of knowledge does it generate relative to the social and subjective construction of truth? Okay, and that's the modernist versus postmodern divide. Okay, so you get a modern postmodern divide, and you get a mind-body or matter-mind relation problem. And just look at philosophy; it's fucking riddled with this. I mean, it's just all these problems are just ubiquitous. Everyone chimes in on them, okay? If that's the case, that's the Enlightenment gap, then it is 100% clear why we would then have what I really initially discovered is the problem of psychology, which is the scientific approach to mind. Okay, there's no way if you have that as your Enlightenment frame and you're going to try to follow the Enlightenment tradition and generate a science of mind, that would be fucking impossible given the Enlightenment gap, and hence it was. Okay, and then the way psychology solved the problem was it punted completely on coherent ontology. You can't get ontology.
Environment's gone.
Ontology is done. All you do is you apply the epistemology of science, which sees behavior then infers mental process. And that's the science of behavior and mental process. And that's why you open up a 101 textbook and like, oh, okay, you have folk psychology interests over here. And then what is psychology? Psychology is the science of behavior and mental process. And then they sleight of hand, and you think you're looking at behavior and mental process, and then they tell you all about science. Okay. And then you train, they do this at James Madison. For 2 years at James Madison, after you take a Psych 101 course, you do behavioral methodology courses. There are 4 or 5 courses of behavioral methodology you have to take before you're even allowed to take personality, abnormal, cognitive. So they basically indoctrinate you into the behavioral methodological structure. So they justify you as a scientist, which they only mean epistemologically. They don't tell you this, but they basically tell you we'll never understand ontology. But actually, all scientific knowledge that is actually generalizable is the ontological product. I mean, right, it's the periodic fucking table. It's the periodic table of the elements. It's fucking general relativity. It's natural selection. Those are ontological theories. Whatever the fucking methods are, that's the product. The idea. So this is why I get so fucking insane about psychology. The idea that we have actually the entire field has essentially abdicated the idea that you could get ontological clarity and then simply follow the methods basically means that we have doubled down on a correct model of science that only validates the method and essentially guarantees that you'll never actually get a coherent product.
Right. It's doomed from the start, right? If you just continue down that path, it's literally just missing such a key component or set of key components.
So then the last thing you see is exactly what you said, is like people will build, I call them sand castles. They'll build their little mid-level theories, and then they'll gain insights and they'll have some empirical truth by that. But then how you back that insight up into an overarching ontological frame that places it in proper relationship to other insights, that becomes essentially impossible. You can't do that. You get a proliferation of sandcastles, but they're grounded to a conceptual system that's sand, and it's just a matter really of washing them away and building new sandcastles. And that's why we have this unbelievable proliferation of mid-level theories with no coherent organization that generates cumulative ontological knowledge. So
when your students try to use this theory to publish within these smaller domains, do they get like reviewer feedback that like, hey, this is weird, or how does that part go?
Yeah, I'm in a PsyD program, Doctor of Psychology, okay, not a PhD. All right?
Okay, so yeah, so it's not even research focused. Is that what you mean?
So it's not research focused.
Okay.
So they publish occasionally, but no one gets, well, they'll occasionally get sort of adjunct clinical academic jobs, but this is not, if you're there for a research position, don't come to our program.
Okay, so, great. Yeah, so that clears a lot
of to deal with that.
The
so anyway, I've been rambling on. I know you have questions. Sorry, I get all excited.
No, I love your
somebody actually grasp this. You know, it's like, oh my god, I'll talk to you all fucking day, Robin.
Great. Well, we can set up some meetings in the future, and spend all summer talking about your ideas for sure. And so question number one: who is John Vervaeke, and what does he mean to you? Or if it's easier, how did you first hear about John and his work, and what about it initially interested you?
I mean, it took me about, 15 minutes to fall in love with the guy. He's an unbelievable, for me, he's an unbelievable fellow kindred spirit. Okay. So I see him as somebody who is willing and has the courage to see the necessity of addressing the real problems that we face, both conceptual real problems and their existential implications, and to embody that in relationship to the way he operates as a professional, and then embodies that as he operates as a person. Okay. And then to live that at a high level of sophistication, grace, and integrity, well, fucking A, sign me up.
And so the next question, what are the 4 ways of knowing, and why are they improving on how most educators teach about the mind and human knowledge? And especially with all the rest of these questions, if you want to say what's kind of parallel in your system or tie it to your work too, I think that's perfectly on track.
Okay, so what we want to make sure that we understand, if education is at least in part the cultivation of knowing, okay, and then we want to know for what, all right, what has happened in the educational system is knowing that things are true to score well on tests that then become objective indicators of some sort of additional performance to move on or not in a society that then generates, okay, now you can go do this shit. Okay. That's the educational system that emerged. And that has a particular set of logic, but it's unbelievably narrow when we think about the process of knowing how to live. Okay. And there's an enormous amount of different variants in knowing how to live. And John affords us a brilliant taxonomy to specify the various kinds of knowing. Okay. So the first P, we'll just go from the base, procedural knowing. Okay. So procedural knowing is a skill-based knowing that puts you in a particular situation that affords the capacity to essentially follow an embodied recipe of step 1, step 2, step 3 that affords you capacity to generate power and skill. Okay. I like to then expand this to create the extension of procedural knowing in terms of complexity. Okay. So, and the reason I'll do this is clear because it then gets into my system. So there are procedural knowings that you can then deploy, although initially the procedural knowings always require a task-oriented conscious focus. Simple procedural knowings then get downloaded into an automatic habit system. Okay. And this is obvious to anybody that watches themselves learn how to tie your shoe, ride a bike, drive a car, right? When you're first confronted with the task, it's overloaded in relationship to all the apparent variables that you have to try to regulate, okay? But the system can download and offload these particular behavioral repertoires through learning so that if they're sequenced in a particular way, they become automatic procedural memories, okay? So when you just get it deployed with, oh, put on your shoes by the time you're 15, if you're a typically developing kid, you drop those shoes on and boom, you're thinking about running off and playing basketball as your hands magically tie the shoes, okay? And that's remarkable. And what it shows is we basically have a habit procedural system, okay? And evolutionarily, almost certainly, this habit procedural system is the first layered system in the sensory motor looping of animals, okay? I mean, a situation contingent sequence that deploys fixed action patterns that allows the animal to control stuff that doesn't require an enormous amount of hierarchical systems that are juxtaposing between all sorts of variables, okay? What emerges then becomes a second kind of knowing, okay? Or at least I'm going to come back to the fourth kind of knowing. I'm going to give you 3 stacks and then give you an interesting fourth, which is John's favorite, okay? So the first is this procedural, drops into the habit system. Then what happens is as animals increase in their sophistication to anticipate and simulate, there's a consolidate and guide in its interaction. There's the emergence of perspectival knowing, okay? This is John's second P. We definitely know this is in the animal and bird kingdom, may all the way go down into, God only knows how far phylogenetically it goes down. John and I have been talking about this for a while. We'll certainly say, as us as primates can say, in the animal mammal kingdom, there's the emergence of essentially a mind's eye, okay? The mind's eye has an adjectival frame, an adverbial frame around an adjectival screen, to use some of John's language. The adverbial frame brings together a here-ness, now-ness, and togetherness, okay, of perception, places them in relation, and then gives you adjectival properties and the phenomenological simple experiences. Oh, I have a mind's eye, okay? And that is somehow, in my experience, there's a collection of perceptual wholes that present themselves to me and are bound together and give me a picture of the landscape, okay? And perspectival knowing means that you're actually able to take that model, okay, the virtual model, in proper relationship to the agent and real relationship, and create a salient landscape so you're able to pick out relevant things, okay? And classically, you can take somebody like a chess player just looking at a chessboard. An expert chess player will have a perspectival view of the chessboard and instantly see it as a gestalt, okay? Some people will talk about a sculpture, okay? A novice looks at it as a bunch of pieces together, okay? They can't organize the salience landscape instantaneously in relationship to a perceptual gestalt. So the expert chess player has a perspectival view of the system. And you will just, if you're a novice, you're like, there's the horsey. I guess it's next to the goddamn castle, okay? It's a totally different frame of perspectival knowing. The third knowing is the propositional knower. Okay, and from my vantage, this is your semantic syntactical statements, okay? You can describe this a couple of different ways. There's what's called semantic knowing, and then there's propositional knowing. Propositional knowing, from my vantage point, is key, and I'm always going to want to put that in a linguistic, semantic, syntactical frame, meaning that there are words, symbols, okay, and then are in grammar place that make truth claims propositionally. Okay, this is a fundamentally novel form of knowing in the animal kingdom, and it is certainly, if animals have this at all, that's very limited. I don't basically think they have it at all, and it's a fundamentally human form. And in the unified theory, this says this creates an entirely new kind of interrelation around the dimensions of justification. Okay, propositional knowing is then with the science and philosophy, people in the West in particular, we're like, oh God, we need to know analytically what's true. And the education and the entire university system sort of took off, and we're going to know that things are true, and then we're going to educate. But notice skill-based stuff, perspectival, okay? And then the final one is the fundamental, what John sees as across the stack, essentially, it's called participatory. And it's the process by which you actually see and identify yourself as an agent in the arena relation and create when it's done well, it's the proper identification of your place and the ability essentially to dance in novel jazz-like ways with the environment, okay? So a classic example of a participatory would be or the distinction between this is like, hey, you have a good skilled person who's a charmer and extrovert and knows how to enter a party, never been to this party before, but plops himself, knows instantaneously about how to identify himself as a novel party goer. I mean, new to the system, but then knows how to engender conversation with others, knows not how to overstep bounds, understands the particular, reads nuance. And then you have a socially avoidant, completely awkward, kid on the spectrum, not to be judgmental, enter into the system and basically sit there and be like, I'm completely overloaded and I have no idea what to do. Okay. So one guy's able to enter, get flow, and the other one just completely sees the landscape, has no idea how to identify, gets completely anxious, freezes, and then simply can't participate as the clear identity that captures the agent arena relation. Okay. So what John really emphasizes is the importance of the participatory through the stack. We need to know dynamically how to engage. And John actually makes a very important epistemological point that we should emphasize dynamic transjectives, which really pragmatic transactions, as a particular kind of knowing and a particular kind of outcome. And it's very valuable than say, oh, objective fact claims or subjective experiences. No, actually, what are and this of course gets to recursive relevance realization, but what are the transjective interactives that create growth and adaptive situations versus those that create narrowing, breakdown, inability to achieve particular goals, etc. And the participatory knowing is most closely related to that.
That's excellent. And then what are the three orders, nomological, normative, and narrative, and how does thinking in these terms help people live a more intelligible or meaningful life? Or if they're totally not interesting to you, we can definitely move on from them.
No, I mean, I think this is something, so John places these orders and they're very useful categories, okay? We have to know how to name things, okay? We have to understand kind of what is, we have to understand what our stories are about shit, okay? I then drop all of this into a broader category called justification systems, okay? So for me, what we're really talking about here at a higher order level than any of these three, okay, is the networks of propositions that we humans as persons connect together to tell us is an ought, okay? And then there are nomenological and ontological kinds of claims, which connect more to is, and narrative, which will then collectively organize ourselves to bridge is to ought, okay? All right. And there are mythic structures of narrative, and there are logo structures that we want to then use to name shit and then organize our understanding of them. Okay. So he can afford us a particular framing of that sort of a taxonomy of aspects of our justificatory systems, which I think is really important. When I hear that, I want to have John back up a step and say there's a class function here across all three. Okay. And that's called the justificatory systems, the propositional networks that we are using as cultured persons to make sense out of the world. And that was one of the great insights. First, the really key insight of the unified theory is that the thing that makes us different is that we're justifying apes. Like we built these propositional networks of justification, and then we hunt and build those systems. And then they bridge in different ways. Like one big is there's justification of is and justification of ought, which are, as Hume notes, there is a line upon which we can separate. And as John notes, that doesn't mean these are functionally dichotomized, especially not in the goddamn real world. And justification system says, you know, totally, those things are yoked together in the real world because you're actually, you have what is, how do you name it? And then what ought to be in relationship, existential, axiological, value-based concerns. Those are all different kinds of questions. So that's whenever I hear John talk about that, my particular spin on it is actually do higher order back up and then talk about their interrelation.
Yeah, so is that like they're like the virtual engine, like combining them is the virtual engine that lets a person be a person on top of those lower levels that were there preceding this person phenomenon.
Exactly. So right, you are a primate, and then you have this potentiality into the propositional space, okay? And then it has different kinds of propositional networks that are going to solve particular kinds of problems. Okay. And then that potentiality is the window into that is your language acquisition device through your left hemisphere. And then the networks are the propositional networks that then are embedded and attached to perspectival networks and procedural networks that are actually part of your primate self. Okay. but it's the opening of this channel that affords, watch your dog. Your dog hangs around with you, talks as much and hears as much language as your kids do. But if you have a dog and a kid and you get them at the same time, they behave radically different 3 years later. Okay, radically different. The dog still run around, say, chase that, get that. The kid starts asking questions. Why do we eat cookies before dinner? You know, it's like, and now all of a sudden the kid enters into the justificatory space. There's a lot of cognitive capacity, of course, underneath that, like a Tomasello, and there's a lot of other people to look at. But fundamentally, the thing that really launches the kids into the total is the socialization on the culture person plane of justification. And it's learning then the downloading of our ideological webs and networks, which have nomenological, ontological, narrative features.
Yeah, that's excellent. I could ask like 100 questions on that. You just get my brain spinning. So my next question is, and this is a perfect question for you, what are any barriers to appreciating, understanding, or applying ideas from like John's or your work? And maybe just like to really open it up to the culture.
Listen, people doing their thing want to grab a hold of a particular kind of insight. Okay. That's digestible. Okay. So you get things like growth mindset, which I know John's not a huge fan of, right? Okay. So it's like, oh, hey, if you just help people, if they have trouble, make sure that they make certain attributions that, hey, I had trouble, but it's really an opportunity to learn. And I believe I can grow and learn from this, as opposed to, oh my God, this means essentially that I'm stupid. Okay. Hey, if we can just teach kids to do that, woohoo. Okay. And listen, if you're a little shopper, how much fucking time you got? It's like, okay, yeah, I want to read a little blog, and you're telling me I can get this much mileage out of this change in attribution. Woohoo. Okay. So that's why everyone knows about growth mindset. People don't know about John's work at all. Why? Because John's work's unbelievably networked and complicated. Okay. All right. It's like, oh, you have to know this. Well, actually, you have to contextualize it there. And then you have to know this. And you have to think about this. And it's like, but how can you actually learn that if you actually need to know the background? And that's one of the challenges. Okay. There's he's got 50 lectures, that's 50 fucking hours, that's more than a whole work week for people, with a required to actually understand it, a background knowledge that would take, 2 years of learning so that you can actually digest the 50 hours so it's high order stuff that many people won't have the bandwidth for very understandably. So with the documentary and other kinds of things, our task is to try to translate John's work into something that's useful. And quite frankly, if John's work's really fucking complicated, I don't need to say anything about mine, because mine actually is layered across a number of different novel terms and insights. I mean, John's got recursive relevance realization. I got 9 key ideas on a tree of life in a garden back there, okay, which are all like novel insights around a particular structure, which is just sort of like, give it up. There's just the barriers there. So I have to fundamentally figure out, and John does too, okay, what's the nugget at the proper audience level for the zone of proximal development so that thing enters into that system. And now all of a sudden you get good generative function off of it. And that's a huge educational process. I think it's going to take a long time. I think we need marketing people and educators and to get excited about this and help people figure out how to metabolize it. Because it's very, very challenging to do because it's asking people to observe and see things that they're not really in a position to do.
Let's wrap up now, for sure.
But normally I have some flexibility, but Poseidon decided to throw me a couple of curveballs these last 2 weeks, and I'm in the process of juggling those things. Hey, man, I really enjoyed it. So nice to actually talk to somebody with the background that you have and for the perspective that I've been developing over here.
Yeah, I think your work is great, and I love learning more about it. So thank you so much, Gregg. And it's great to meet you too personally, because I've seen a lot of you.
I appreciate that, and I've seen you around, and it's really nice to make the connection, friend. So
great.
It's these weaves, man. If we can get a lot of these weaves going, that creates tapestry that really will afford this sort of third person or third thing movement that ties the culture together collectively. So it's great. Love to make these connections.